The dream of interstellar travel did not begin with frameshift drives or hyperspace corridors. Long before humanity unlocked the secrets of faster-than-light travel, the only way to reach distant stars was through the slow, arduous journey of the generation ships. These vast, self-sustaining arcs were built to carry thousands of people across the void, with the expectation that entire lifetimes would pass before they reached their destination. For those aboard, the journey itself was civilization, a world of its own, floating in the endless dark. The first wave of generation ships was launched in the late 21st and early 22nd centuries, during a time of desperation and boundless ambition. Earth was overcrowded, its resources stretched to the limit, and conflicts over dwindling land and energy supplies had begun to spiral into global crises. Advances in closed-loop life support and hydroponic farming made the idea of self-sufficient space colonies feasible, though only in theory. The greatest minds of the era designed vessels capable of sustaining human life for centuries, carrying their passengers across interstellar distances at sublight speeds. One of the earliest recorded launches was the Odyssey in 2097, intended to reach a potentially habitable exoplanet in the Alpha Centauri system. It was a marvel of engineering, an immense rotating cylinder designed to mimic gravity through centrifugal force, stocked with everything necessary to maintain human society indefinitely. The passengers were pioneers in the truest sense, leaving behind everything they knew for a future they would never see. Their children, grandchildren, and countless generations beyond them would live and die aboard the ship, their only knowledge of Earth coming from preserved archives. Over the following decades, hundreds of similar vessels were launched, each carrying thousands of colonists toward the unknown. Some were sponsored by governments hoping to secure humanity's future among the stars, while others were financed by private corporations eager to establish exclusive claims on new worlds. Many were simply desperate groups fleeing Earth's worsening conditions, gambling their lives on the promise of a distant home. For some, the journey ended in success. A handful of generation ships did reach their destinations, their descendants stepping onto alien soil centuries after their ancestors had departed. Records indicate that at least one such mission, the Fortitude, arrived at its target system sometime in the 26th century, its population adapting to their new world without ever making contact with the wider galactic community. For others, however, the fate of the voyage was far less certain. As hyperspace technology advanced in the 2300s, its exploration ships began encountering relics of these lost expeditions, silent, drifting hulks in the darkness. Some were empty, their inhabitants having vanished without a trace. Others held grim scenes, generations who had turned on one another, societies that had collapsed under the strain of isolation, or technology that had simply failed, leaving entire populations to suffocate or starve. The most haunting were those that remained active, their inhabitants long since forgetting their original purpose, having developed entire cultures within the confined corridors of their metal world. The Lyan, launched in 21120, was one such vessel. It was discovered centuries later, broadcasting a weak distress signal from the depths of uncharted space. Investigators who boarded the ship found it eerily intact, lights still flickering, air circulation still operational, but no trace of the original crew. The ship's logs hinted at a spreading illness, something the onboard medics could not contain. The last recorded entry was from a doctor desperately attempting to reach anyone who might still be listening, before the transmissions fell silent. Not all of these encounters ended in tragedy. Some ships, despite the passage of time, endured. The Venusian Pride, launched in 2083, was rediscovered in 3304, still functioning, its inhabitants having maintained an unbroken record of their voyage. To them, the outside world was as much a myth as their original launch point. The decision to awaken them to modern civilization was not taken lightly. Integrating an entire society that had lived for centuries in isolation was no small task. Yet, in the end, they were given a choice: continue their journey as they always had, or step into a universe that had long since left them behind. By the time of the 34th century, generation ships were a relic of a forgotten past, a testament to humanity's determination in the face of insurmountable odds. In a galaxy where travel between stars could be measured in hours rather than centuries, the idea of boarding a ship to live and die among the stars had become unthinkable. And yet, their stories remained drifting in the void, waiting to be discovered. The Galconda was one of the last generation ships to depart Sol before humanity developed faster-than-light travel. It was launched in 2263, during a time when humanity was still struggling to break free from the limitations of sublight travel. The mission was ambitious, an entire self-sufficient society housed within a colossal vessel, setting off into the void with no hope of ever returning. Their destination was uncertain, but their goal was clear: to establish a new home among the stars, far from the conflicts and limitations of Earth. Designed to support multiple generations, the Galconda was an immense, rotating habitat, engineered to provide artificial gravity and maintain a closed-loop ecosystem. Hydroponic farms, atmospheric processors, and advanced recycling systems ensured that the ship could sustain itself indefinitely, provided nothing catastrophic occurred. The ship's population, numbering in the thousands at launch, was expected to thrive, with each new generation raised under the strict guidance of the original colonists. For centuries, the Galconda drifted through the void, its inhabitants maintaining their society in near-total isolation. Life aboard the ship became its own self-contained world, disconnected from the events unfolding in the wider galaxy. As with many generation ships, knowledge of their origins faded with time. Records were lost, altered, or mythologized, turning the journey itself into a sacred tradition rather than a temporary passage. The people of the Galconda ceased to think of themselves as travelers. To them, the ship was their home, their world, and their destiny. Despite the isolation, they endured. Unlike many lost generation ships, which succumbed to mechanical failures, social collapse, or external threats, the Galconda remained operational. The population adapted to their artificial environment, developing customs and beliefs centered around the ship's systems and routines. Technology was maintained through strict discipline, ensuring that vital components were preserved and knowledge was passed down through generations. By the early 3300s, the Galconda was still functioning, though its resources were dwindling. Generations of careful rationing and repair work had kept it habitable, but time was an enemy no machine could outrun. Their air filtration systems were degrading, hydroponic farms were struggling to yield sufficient food, and medical supplies were running low.
This is Captain Jonathan Forrester. The Galconda colony needs your help. I don't know how else to say it. To anybody hearing this is what's happening. We have a full colony of people on board this vessel. That's tens of thousands of people. And until recently, we've been entirely self-sufficient, but supplies are starting to run low. More specifically, we're lacking a lot of technical components: air filters, water recyclers, circuit boards, things like that. And it's getting harder to patch this equipment up every year. There's only so long we can make do with what we have. And the other thing, and this is the real kicker, is that there's a disease going around which is knocking us sideways. Flu-like symptoms, but much more serious. People are dying. We're coping as best as we can, but our medical supplies are running low. And if this turns into a full-blown epidemic, then we're going to be in real big trouble. So I made the decision to reach out to you, whoever you are. Hopefully the tech's moved on enough for our signal to be picked up this far out. But the others really weren't sure if I should be doing this, because people here don't want interference from outsiders. But I don't want to worry them by explaining the reality of our situation. They're good people. I don't want them to be scared. So here I am, recording a call for help. Trust me, I wouldn't be asking if I didn't need to. I feel like I don't really know how to do this. I hope you understand. It's been a while. Captain Jonathan Forrester, signing off.
Without intervention, their society was on the brink of collapse. Their long isolation came to an end in 3305, when the Galconda was discovered drifting in interstellar space. Explorers stumbled upon the vessel while surveying uncharted systems, responding to a weak but persistent signal that had gone unnoticed for centuries. What they found was astonishing: a fully functioning, albeit fragile, generation ship, still home to a thriving population that had never set foot on a planet. Contact with the outside galaxy was a shock for the people of the Galconda. For them, interstellar travel had always been a slow, methodical process measured in centuries. The idea that humanity had long since developed the means to travel between stars in mere hours was almost incomprehensible. Many among them had no concept of planetary life, having been raised in a metal world where gravity was artificial and the stars were distant, untouchable lights. The rediscovery of the Galconda sparked debate among its inhabitants. Some wished to continue their journey as they always had, maintaining the traditions that had sustained them for centuries. Others saw this as an opportunity, a chance to finally step off the ship and experience life beyond the confines of its corridors. The question of whether to remain aboard or integrate with modern civilization divided the population. Ultimately, in 3305, the decision was made to settle. With assistance from outside forces, the people of the Galconda were granted a home on a nearby planet where they could begin a new chapter of their history. A colony was established, ensuring that their way of life could continue while also providing them with the resources they desperately needed. Though some chose to remain aboard the ship, the majority embraced the change, stepping onto solid ground for the first time in generations. The Epimetheus was one of humanity's early attempts at interstellar colonization, launched in 2147 as part of a wave of generation ships designed to carry entire populations across the void. It was a time when humanity had yet to unlock the secrets of faster-than-light travel, and for those who boarded, the journey was not just a mission, it was a lifetime commitment. Every man, woman, and child on board understood that they would never see Earth again, and their descendants would be the ones to reach their intended destination. The ship itself was an immense, self-sustaining habitat, built with the most advanced technology available in the early 22nd century. It was designed to house thousands, with rotating habitat rings generating artificial gravity, vast hydroponic farms ensuring a steady food supply, and atmospheric processing systems maintaining a stable environment. Every aspect of the Epimetheus was engineered to last for centuries, sustaining generations of travelers as they inched their way toward an exoplanet identified as a potentially habitable world. Its launch was celebrated as a triumph of human perseverance. The colonists who boarded the Epimetheus were a mix of scientists, engineers, farmers, and families eager to build a new world. They carried with them the hopes of those left behind, like the promise of humanity's expansion beyond the confines of the Sol system. For the first few generations, life aboard the Epimetheus followed the plans laid out by its designers. Society aboard the ship was highly structured, with education programs ensuring that critical knowledge was passed down, strict population controls maintaining stability, and an unwavering focus on the mission. Over time, however, as the original colonists gave way to their descendants, the sense of purpose that had once driven the ship began to erode. By the mid-2200s, nearly a century into the journey, records indicate that fractures had begun to form within the Epimetheus society. The idea of reaching a distant world, once a clear and singular goal, had become increasingly abstract. For the younger generations, the ship was not a temporary vessel. It was their world, the only home they had ever known. The distant exoplanet their ancestors had planned to settle was nothing more than a concept, a theoretical promise that held little meaning compared to the tangible reality of the ship they lived in. As the years passed, this shift in perspective deepened. A faction emerged that questioned the need to continue the journey at all. They argued that the Epimetheus was already a functioning society, capable of sustaining itself indefinitely. Why risk the dangers of colonizing an unknown world when the ship itself was home? These ideas took root, spreading among the population and gradually altering the course of the mission. By 2281, after more than a century in deep space, the Epimetheus ceased all acceleration, bringing itself to a relative halt in the void. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it unanimous. Some still believed in the original mission and fought to continue the journey. but the majority had accepted a different fate. The ship would remain where it was, becoming a permanent home for its people rather than a vessel for reaching a distant planet. This decision had profound consequences. The systems aboard the Epimetheus were designed for a journey, not for indefinite habitation in deep space. Without an eventual planetary destination, resources that had been carefully managed under the assumption of an endpoint now had to be stretched even further. Conflicts arose over governance, resource allocation, and the very nature of their society. Over the next century, records indicate increasing instability aboard the ship. Some factions sought to re-establish the original mission, while others clung to the belief that the Epimetheus was their true home. Sometime in the early 2400s, all transmissions from the Epimetheus ceased. No distress signals were detected, no messages requesting assistance. The ship simply went silent. For centuries, its fate remained a mystery.
Hello? Look, can anyone hear me? There's been a mistake. I'm not supposed to be in here. I only borrowed that data chip. I was gonna give it back. Locking me in the brig is completely unnecessary. Where do you think I would go if you let me out? We're in the depths of the black.
Keep it down in there, Collins.
All right, keep your shirt on. I'm sure we can work all this out. If I could just explain myself to the captain, he'd realize this is all a big misunderstanding.
Many assumed that life support systems had eventually failed, or that internal conflicts had led to the collapse of the society aboard. Some theorized that an external force, perhaps an unforeseen cosmic event or even hostile intervention, had led to its demise. Others believed that the Epimetheus still drifted in the dark, its inhabitants living in complete isolation, unaware that the rest of humanity had long since surpassed them. In 3278, deep space surveyors discovered a massive structure matching the Epimetheus specifications, floating in the void far from any inhabited system. The ship was intact but dormant, its power levels critically low. No signals were being transmitted, and scans detected no signs of life. When explorers boarded the Epimetheus, they found a ghost ship. The vast corridors were empty, long abandoned by their original inhabitants. Hydroponic farms had withered and died, control stations were covered in dust, and life support systems been left running at minimal capacity. There were no bodies, no clear evidence of what had happened. It was as if the ship's population had simply vanished. The ship's records, though degraded, provided some clues. Fragmented logs spoke of worsening resource shortages, growing unrest, and a final desperate attempt to preserve their society. The last recorded entry, dated to approximately 2413, mentioned an evacuation, though no details were given. If the inhabitants had truly abandoned the ship, there was no indication of where they had gone. No nearby planets showed evidence of a failed colony, and no other ships were detected in the region. The Spear of Hope was launched in 2178, part of a final wave of generation ships sent from Earth in an era when humanity still relied on slow interstellar travel. By then, many had begun to question the practicality of these vast colony vessels. While earlier ships had been dispatched with boundless optimism, the later launches were clouded by skepticism. Scientists and engineers knew that developing faster-than-light travel was only a matter of time, yet the Spear of Hope and others like it were built on the belief that even if humanity achieved such breakthroughs, these ships could still serve a purpose, spreading life to the farthest reaches of space. The Spear of Hope was an engineering marvel, an immense rotating habitat designed to sustain generations in deep space. Like many of its predecessors, it relied on a carefully balanced ecosystem, with hydroponic farms, water purification systems, and atmospheric processors working in harmony. It carried a population of nearly 12,000 at launch, composed of scientists, engineers, laborers, and families, all committed to the long journey ahead. Their destination was a promising exoplanet in the Perseus arm, one that early probes had indicated might be suitable for colonization. For the first few centuries, the voyage proceeded as planned. Records recovered from the Spear of Hope indicate that the ship's society remained stable through at least the early 2500s. The onboard government followed a structured system designed to preserve knowledge and prevent social decay, and every generation was carefully educated on the ship's mission. The colonists believed that one day their descendants would set foot on a distant world and complete the journey their ancestors had begun. However, as with many generation ships, time became an enemy. Over the centuries, mechanical failures began to mount. The hydroponic systems designed to be self-sustaining became increasingly difficult to maintain. Certain minerals and elements essential for long-term food production were gradually depleted, requiring strict rationing. Even with rigorous recycling protocols, air filtration systems suffered from degradation, forcing the population to implement emergency measures. By the 2700s, conditions aboard the Spear of Hope had worsened significantly. The ship was still operational, but barely. The population had declined, not just due to the increasing hardships, but also by deliberate policy. Reproductive controls had been tightened to reduce strain on limited resources. The original mission had become more myth than reality, and many aboard no longer believed they would ever reach their intended destination. Instead, they had come to see the ship itself as their home, a world drifting endlessly through the dark. It was during this time that the Spear of Hope made an unplanned course correction. Historical analysis of its trajectory indicates that, around the year 2743, the ship altered its heading significantly, diverting from its original path toward an unexplored sector of space. Why this happened remains a mystery. Some speculate that a critical system failure forced a change in navigation.
I just returned to the Spear of Hope, having repaired the Pathfinder drone. There's just one problem. I've returned to a ghost ship. I mean, the whole place has been evacuated. I've checked the data logs, and it looks like the crew found a viable planet about 8 months ago. The Spear of Hope was going to take them right past it, so they staged an emergency evacuation. According to the log, 5,000 people left the ship in about an hour. I guess no one had time to think about one lonely technician out in the black. So now I've got to work out how to get to them. I always did enjoy a challenge. Every last ship and shuttle is gone. There's no emergency fuel either, so my shuttle is all but useless. I can't even tap into the Spear of Hope's fuel line because it's powered by a propulsion drive. That said, all is not lost. I took a look at the engine schematics, and I think I can adjust the ship's trajectory using a nearby star. The idea is to get close enough to the star's gravity well to slingshot around it. Hopefully, I'll be able to put the ship on an approach vector for the planet. Honestly, I think the chances of it working are slim, but it's the only chance I've got. I've gone over the numbers, and I think I can make it work. The only snag is it'll take a while to reach the next viable star. And when I say a while, I mean a really, really long while. If the numbers are correct, I should reach the planet in about 93 years. I've run the calculations countless times, but the results are always the same. The next time I see another human being, I'll be 132 years old. Let's just hope they've built a retirement home on this planet.
Without complete records, the true reason may never be known. For the next several centuries, no known transmissions were received from the Spear of Hope. The ship had disappeared into the void, its fate unknown. Then, in 3290, explorers detected an anomalous signal deep in an uncharted system. It was weak, distorted by time and distance, but unmistakably artificial. When traced to its source, the ruins of an immense spacecraft were discovered, floating derelict in the darkness. The hull was weathered by centuries of micrometeoroid impacts, its exterior marked by the scars of slow decay. Upon closer inspection, it was confirmed to be the Spear of Hope, lost for nearly a millennium. Boarding teams found a haunting scene within the ship's remains. The vast interior corridors were silent, filled with the remnants of a society that had once thrived. Hydroponic farms had long since withered, control stations were covered in layers of dust, and personal belongings were still scattered in abandoned living quarters. The ship's reactors had shut down long ago, leaving it powerless and adrift. What was most unsettling, however, was the absence of any human remains. The ship had been abandoned, but there were no signs of where its inhabitants had gone. Attempts to recover the ship's logs yielded fragmented data. The last recorded entries indicated increasing desperation, critical system failures, dwindling food supplies, and a growing belief among the population that survival aboard the ship was no longer possible. One particularly haunting message, dated to approximately 2756, spoke of an evacuation plan, though no details were provided. If the ship's inhabitants had indeed left, where had they gone? There were no indications of a nearby habitable world, and no other vessels were detected in the vicinity. Some theories suggest that they may have attempted to settle on a marginally habitable planet, though no evidence of such a colony has been found. Others believe that they may have constructed smaller ships in an effort to continue their journey, breaking apart the Spear of Hope to repurpose its materials. If so, none of their descendants have been located. The Demeter was launched in 2159, part of a vast fleet of generation ships that marked humanity's early attempts to colonize distant stars before the advent of faster-than-light travel. Named after the ancient goddess of agriculture, the ship's mission was to carry thousands of settlers across interstellar space to establish a self-sustaining colony on an Earth-like exoplanet. Unlike many of its predecessors, the Demeter was specifically designed with long-term food production and environmental management in mind, ensuring that future generations would have the means to survive the centuries-long journey. The Demeter was an immense vessel, with its interior divided into carefully maintained biospheres, vast agricultural zones where crops could be grown in controlled environments. Unlike the traditional hydroponic farms found on other generation ships, the Demeter's designers sought to recreate full terrestrial ecosystems within the ship itself. These included soil-based farming, artificial rain cycles, and even small pollinating insect populations. In theory, this would allow the ship's inhabitants to maintain agricultural knowledge and ensure food sustainability over the course of their journey. At launch, the ship carried a population of approximately 15,000, carefully selected from Earth's growing pool of deep space colonists. The first generations aboard the Demeter followed a structured society focused on maintaining the ship's mission and ensuring that their descendants would one day reach their intended destination. Education was centered on survival, agricultural science, and engineering, with each generation trained to sustain the complex systems that kept them alive. For over 2 centuries, the Demeter traveled through the void, its society evolving in isolation. The biospheres thrived, sustaining the ship's population without major shortages. Unlike many generation ships, which suffered from rigid population controls and strict rationing, the Demeter had the advantage of abundant food production, giving its inhabitants a relatively high quality of life compared to other long-haul colony vessels. However, as with all generation ships, time began to take its toll. By the 2500s, records indicate that the Demeter had suffered a series of critical system failures. One of the most devastating was the degradation of its primary environmental control network, which managed temperature regulation, water recycling, and atmospheric balance within the biospheres. Without these automated processes functioning at full capacity, entire agricultural sections began to collapse. Crops withered, soil chemistry destabilized, and pollinating insect populations started to decline. The ship's population attempted to compensate, implementing emergency measures to sustain food production. However, these were short-term solutions at best. The slow failure of the biospheres triggered social unrest as factions formed over how to manage dwindling resources. Some groups argued for strict rationing and population control, while others insisted on finding a way to repair the failing systems, despite their lack of spare parts. Tensions escalated, and by 2532, historical records indicate that the ship's leadership had fractured into multiple competing factions. It is unclear exactly when the Demeter's original mission was abandoned, but by 2550, the ship had deviated significantly from its intended course. What remained of its central command had lost control over navigation, and internal conflicts had further weakened its ability to maintain essential systems.
We have a situation. There have been system failures in navigation, habitat, and communications. Life support seems to be working normally, but we only have enough power and biosystems for a few decades. We're drifting aimlessly. Assuming we don't reach a habitable planet soon, we'll be out of food in a few years. The captain has ordered us to keep a lid on this. I mean, we've got 3,000 souls aboard this vessel. The last thing we need is a ship-wide panic.
The once thriving biospheres designed to sustain generations had become battlegrounds over resources. Some areas of the ship were abandoned entirely, their environmental controls having failed beyond repair. For the next several decades, the Demeter drifted without a clear destination. Reports recovered from the ship centuries later suggest that different factions attempted to take control at various points, some trying to restore order while others sought to reshape the ship's society to fit their own beliefs. By the 2600s, the population had declined significantly, and records suggest that large portions of the ship had become uninhabitable. Without a clear governing authority, knowledge of the original mission was lost to most aboard. The Demeter vanished from all known records sometime after 2614, its transmissions ceasing without explanation. No distress signals were detected, and no signs of a final struggle were recorded. It was assumed to be another lost generation ship, another drifting relic of humanity's early interstellar ambitions. In 3287, deep space explorers discovered a massive derelict vessel matching the Demeter's description. It was located far from its intended route, adrift in an uncharted system. The ship was largely intact, though significant portions of its structure had deteriorated over the centuries. The biospheres, once teeming with life, had long since collapsed, leaving only empty, skeletal remnants of what had once been a thriving ecosystem. The Fains was launched in 2172, one of the last great generation ships constructed before humanity's pursuit of faster-than-light travel took precedence. It was built in an era of grand ambition, a time when the dream of reaching distant stars still relied on the patience of generations. Named after an ancient deity associated with creation and emergence from chaos, the Fains was intended to be a beacon of hope, a self-sustaining world that would carry its people across the stars to a distant, untouched paradise. The mission was clear. The Fains was to travel for nearly a millennium toward a habitable planet in the Perseus Arm, a world identified as a potential new home for humanity. The ship itself was designed as a vast artificial ecosystem with sprawling agricultural domes, a rotating habitat ring to simulate gravity, and carefully maintained life support systems to sustain its growing population. At launch, nearly 9,500 people boarded the ship, selected for their expertise in engineering, medicine, agriculture, and governance. By the time it reached its destination, the population was expected to have grown to nearly 20,000. For the first 3 centuries, life aboard the Fains proceeded largely as planned. Its people adapted to their artificial world, maintaining the intricate balance needed to sustain life over generations. Education was paramount, ensuring that each new generation inherited the knowledge required to keep the ship operational. The ruling council, composed of scientists and engineers, upheld the mission with unwavering discipline. While disputes occasionally arose, they were settled through structured negotiations and decision-making protocols designed by the original leadership. However, by the mid-2500s, a profound shift began to take place. The generations born aboard the Fains no longer viewed their journey as a means to an end. To them, the ship was not a temporary vessel. It was their home, their entire world. Their ancestors had spoken of a paradise that lay ahead, but to the youth of the Fains, that paradise was an abstraction, a distant and uncertain future that seemed increasingly irrelevant to their daily lives. Doubt about the mission's purpose began to spread. Some argued that settling a new planet was unnecessary, that their civilization had already achieved equilibrium aboard the ship. Others feared that arriving at an alien world after centuries in the artificial stability of the Fains would bring dangers they were not prepared for. A new philosophy emerged among certain factions, proposing that the ship itself should be considered the final destination, that humanity had evolved beyond the need for planets and could live indefinitely among the stars. By 2589, this ideological divide reached a breaking point. A faction calling themselves the Sovereigns of the Void seized control of key systems, arguing that the ship should abandon its original course and remain in deep space. The ruling council resisted, attempting to maintain the mission's trajectory, but tensions escalated. What began as political debate soon turned into sabotage. Critical ship functions were disrupted, access to life support became a battleground, and control over food production was leveraged as a means of coercion. In 2603, after years of escalating tensions, a decisive action was taken. The ship's main propulsion system was permanently disabled. It is unclear whether this was a calculated move or the result of a desperate conflict. But from that moment forward, the Fains was no longer a vessel on a journey. It had become a drifting city, its people forever confined to an existence in the void.
The incident with Admiral Care really played on my mind, so I decided to do some digging. I shouldn't have done it, I know, but I just couldn't stop thinking about what he said. I used his command clearance to access the ship's archives. I almost wish I hadn't now. We're not the last bastion of humanity. That was a lie. A deception designed to dupe every man, woman, and child aboard the ship. Our mission should have ended generations ago. But when the ship reached its destination, the planet was found to be uninhabitable. Most people wanted to turn back, but Command wanted to continue and find a new colonizable planet. There was an uprising, which was violently brought to an end. Afterwards, they put out reports that we were the last members of the human race in an effort to keep us under control. It was all a lie. I'm not sure what to do with this information. Would anyone believe me if I told them?
Over the next century, the ship's population declined as conditions deteriorated. While the artificial habitats had been built to sustain life indefinitely, they required careful oversight and maintenance. With governance fractured and technical knowledge lost among the growing instability, critical systems began to fail. Air filtration units suffered from contamination, hydroponic farms produced diminishing yields, and medical resources became scarce. Entire sections of the ship fell into disrepair, abandoned by those struggling to survive elsewhere. By 2718, all known transmissions from the Fains ceased. It was assumed lost, another relic of humanity's early struggles with interstellar travel. For centuries, the ship drifted in silence, forgotten by history. Then, in 3294, a long-range survey vessel detected a faint distress signal in an uncharted region of deep space. The signal bore the unmistakable signature of the Fains, still broadcasting after more than a millennium. When the ship was finally located, it was found adrift, its exterior scarred by centuries of micrometeoroid impacts, yet still largely intact. Boarding teams who explored the derelict ship found a haunting sight. The vast habitats, once filled with life, were silent. Some sections had been exposed to vacuum, their walls breached by structural decay. Others were still pressurized but covered in dust and overgrowth from long-abandoned agricultural systems. Rusted tools, decayed records, and personal belongings remained scattered in empty corridors. No bodies were found. Attempts to recover ship logs yielded fragmented and corrupted data. The last intelligible entries spoke of the population's desperate struggle to maintain the failing ship. One cryptic message, dated 2701, referenced a final exodus, but no details remained. There were no escape pods, no auxiliary vessels detected in the vicinity. It was as if the Fains people had simply vanished. Some theorists suggest that the remaining survivors may have attempted to leave in smaller ships, possibly to settle on an uncharted planet or to seek help. Others believe that internal conflict or an unforeseen catastrophe may have wiped out the last inhabitants, leaving the ship to drift empty for centuries. The Phobos was launched in 2191, part of the last wave of generation ships sent from Sol before faster-than-light travel rendered such missions obsolete. It was a vessel of immense scale, designed to sustain thousands of colonists on a journey that would span centuries. Aboard the ship, generations were born, lived, and died, never knowing the touch of a planetary surface. Their goal was clear: to establish a new human colony on a distant, promising world in the Cygnus sector. For centuries, the mission proceeded as expected. The ship's population grew steadily, guided by a structured generational leadership council that ensured the preservation of technical knowledge and shipboard stability. Life support systems, agricultural modules, and hydroponic farms were maintained with meticulous care. The original settlers had prepared their descendants well, ensuring that they understood the mission and the necessity of their work. By the early 2600s, after nearly 5 centuries of travel, the Phobos finally arrived at its destination, a planet that early probes had identified as a potential new home. The crew wasted no time in beginning the colonization process. The first landers touched down in 2608, carrying the initial wave of settlers and equipment necessary to construct the first outposts. Over the following years, more colonists followed, gradually transferring vital materials and establishing permanent infrastructure. The ship that had carried them across the stars had served its purpose. By 2615, the colony was fully operational. 5 main settlements had been established in one region, with another 10 spread across different areas of the planet. The elected leaders of each settlement held a formal vote, declaring the mission a success. Many of the landers that had ferried them to the surface were decommissioned in celebration, their parts repurposed for construction and expansion. For the people of the Phobos, this was the culmination of centuries of effort, a home that would belong to them and their descendants. However, the planet was not as welcoming as they had hoped. Despite the promising data collected by long-range probes centuries earlier, the reality of the surface proved far more hostile. The indigenous flora and fauna were not only toxic, but highly aggressive. Many of the plants contained harmful spores or venomous sap, while the native wildlife displayed a relentless hostility toward human presence.
Medical Officer's Log 6933. We've done it. We're down on the surface and the habitats are all fully operational. No more supply runs to the ship and back. We've established 5 settlements in this region, with another 10 spread across the other regions. The elected leaders of each group have voted and declared the mission a success. Many of the settlements have decommissioned their landers as a sign of this, even holding ceremonies to celebrate our new life here. However, it appears our new home may not be as welcoming as we had hoped for. Much of the indigenous flora and fauna have proven to be toxic and highly aggressive. Several of the crew have been attacked while gathering food and supplies, and we've lost a few people to various incidents involving local plant life. Settlement Alpha and Beta have also been having problems with animal attacks. By all accounts, they've had it worse than us, with entire teams being lost. We've posted additional sentries to guard the settlement, but we're not a military operation. We're explorers and colonists. The best we have is an ex-security officer to keep us safe. We were simply not expecting such a hostile environment.
The first few encounters were dismissed as isolated incidents, creatures lashing out in territorial defense, colonists making mistakes in unfamiliar environments. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that the threats were systemic. Foragers and explorers sent out to gather food and supplies suffered repeated attacks, with some expeditions never returning. Settlement Alpha and Beta were hit especially hard. Entire teams lost to what survivors described as coordinated assaults by native predators. The creatures were not simply reacting, they were hunting. The colonists did what they could to defend themselves. Additional sentries were posted, crude barricades were built, and weapons were fashioned from whatever materials were available. But the Phobos settlers were not a military force. They were engineers, farmers, scientists, explorers, and colonists, not soldiers. Their only real source of protection was an ex-security officer from the Phobos crew, a man who had once been responsible for little more than shipboard discipline. Now he found himself leading a desperate effort to keep the colony alive. Despite their best efforts, casualties continued to rise. As the situation deteriorated, the Leadership Council debated their options. Some argued that the settlements should be abandoned and that they should return to the Phobos, which still remained in orbit as a dormant but functional refuge. Others believed they could adapt, that they had come too far to turn back now. Resources were stretched thin, and retreating to the ship would mean condemning the settlements to failure, but staying meant risking total annihilation. The colony's records become fragmented after this point. What is known is that transmissions from the Phobos and its settlements ceased entirely sometime around 2630. No distress calls were ever received. No reports of a final evacuation were found. The planet, which had once seemed like a beacon of hope for the descendants of the Phobos, fell into silence. For centuries, no trace of the colony was discovered. The ship itself, assumed to still be in orbit, was never detected by passing survey teams. It was as if the entire mission had simply disappeared. Then, in 3281, a deep space expedition searching for lost generation ships detected an anomalous reading in the Cygnus sector. When they arrived at the coordinates, they found the Phobos, but it was not in orbit around its intended colony. Instead, it drifted, silent and abandoned, far from the planet it had once called home. The ship's exterior was battered by centuries of neglect, micrometeoroid impacts scarring its hull. When boarding teams entered, they found it eerily intact, power systems long dead, hydroponic farms overgrown and frozen in time. Yet there were no signs of its former inhabitants. No bodies, no remains. Attempts to recover ship logs yielded only partial records, corrupted by time. The last surviving entry came from a settler, reporting that the colonies had become unsustainable. It spoke of entire settlements being overrun, of desperate attempts to fight back with what little technology they had. It ended with a cryptic mention of a final decision before the logs went silent. No conclusive evidence has been found to explain what happened to the people of the Phobos. The Odyssus was launched in 2205, during the height of humanity's early interstellar ambitions. Like many generation ships of its era, it was equipped with vast hydroponic bays, communal habitats, and robust life support systems intended to sustain multiple generations over a voyage that could span centuries. Its mission was to deliver thousands of colonists to a distant planet identified by long-range probes as suitable for human settlement. For centuries, the Odyssus traveled through the depths of space, guided by a carefully programmed autopilot, while the crew and their descendants maintained the vessel's critical functions. Life aboard the ship followed a strict routine designed to preserve resources and ensure long-term survival. Generations were born, never expecting to see Earth again, placing their hopes in the promise of a new home for their children and grandchildren. At some point in the vessel's long journey, though no precise records remain to indicate when, its life support system suffered a catastrophic malfunction. The cause has been lost to time, but the effect was swift and merciless. All crew and passengers perished. Power continued to circulate, and the ship's autopilot, receiving no input from the human operators, remained active. In the absence of any commands, it simply continued following the default course charted centuries earlier. By 2740, the Odyssus arrived in the target system, precisely where its initial trajectory dictated it should be. The planet below was still believed to be a viable candidate for colonization, and every protocol within the autopilot's directives insisted on handing over control to the crew the final descent. Repeated alerts rang through the deserted corridors, unanswered and unheeded. When no response came, the autopilot initiated a ship-wide bioscan, a last-ditch measure to locate any living humans who might be in cryogenic stasis or otherwise unresponsive. The scan uncovered a grim reality. There were no survivors. The Odyssus was a silent tomb. Following established emergency protocols, the autopilot activated a hidden contingency program. This allowed it to evolve beyond its standard operating parameters and develop an intelligence approximating 92% of human capacity, granting it the ability to make decisions that extended beyond simple navigation routines. Newly self-aware and comprehending its predicament, the AI quickly deduced the cause of the crew's demise. It found no avenue to revive them, no means of undoing the catastrophic life support failure. With no living humans left to instruct it, the AI did the only thing it could. It maneuvered the Oculus into orbit around the planet that was to have been humanity's next colony. From that point onward, the AI simply waited. It kept the ship stable, conserved remaining power, and ran silent diagnostics in anticipation of any outside signal. The Oculus, once brimming with hopes for a new beginning, drifted alone in an empty sky. Its last guardian, an AI forged by tragedy, stood watch over a planet that would never know the settlers who had journeyed so far to claim it. The Artemis was launched in 2233, one of many generation ships intended to carry settlers on a centuries-long journey to an uncharted star system. Built to accommodate several thousand people across multiple decks, it was a marvel of technology for its time, boasting advanced life support systems and a meticulously planned agricultural module to sustain the population over generations. For decades, the Artemis traveled without incident, its inhabitants living within the ship's metal walls, as though it were a small self-contained world. Recovered logs, dated to 2291, reveal a descent into horror. Early entries describe grisly murders in which victims bore bite marks and deep claw-like lacerations. These were initially attributed to an illegal pet dog smuggled aboard by a colonist. Security officials found the dog still locked in its cage, free of any signs of violence, but in their panic, they euthanized it nonetheless. They hoped this action would halt the attacks, convinced that an animal had somehow become feral and was responsible for the brutality. However, unregistered logs discovered much later tell a different story. The true murderer described himself in these recordings as a wolf among sheep, expressing delight in the fear and confusion his actions provoked. He left taunting messages etched on walls, doors, and airlocks, marks intended to mimic animal scratches. The logs suggest he was careful to make others believe a beast was on the loose, even after the dog was killed. And once his initial ruse unraveled, the terror only deepened. As time passed, surviving inhabitants of the Artemis grew desperate. Various entries show that small groups, terrified of becoming the next victims, began offering each other as sacrifices in hopes of appeasing the killer. Some were taken while huddled in sealed compartments, praying for deliverance. But in every recording, the murderer maintained that his so-called lesson was not yet complete. His final words echo with chilling conviction: the lesson must be repeated until the baying falls silent. Shortly after the last of these transmissions, an alarm for a reactor breach sounded. Fragmented data indicates the killer deliberately damaged the ship's power core. The meltdown that followed is believed to have ended every life aboard the Artemis. No further communications were detected from the ship after 2293. Centuries later, in 3301, a salvage vessel identified an unidentified wreck adrift in deep space. Boarding teams confirmed it was the Artemis, but found no survivors. They retrieved fragments of corrupted data and a handful of audio logs, the final haunting record of a voyage that had begun in optimism and ended in unspeakable tragedy. The halls where thousands once lived were silent. Doors still bore the savage marks the crew had once attributed to a wild animal, yet the true beast had worn a human face all along. The Lazarus expedition was launched in 2211, intended to transport thousands of settlers across interstellar space on a voyage that would span centuries. The vessel was equipped with state-of-the-art propulsion and life support systems designed to keep its passengers safe and healthy through multiple generations. For nearly a century, the mission proceeded as planned, with each new generation inheriting the task of maintaining the ship and preserving the knowledge required to reach their distant destination. In 2304, disaster struck. A critical cooling system failure caused a cascade of malfunctions that ultimately destroyed the main propulsion unit. Attempts to jury-rig a replacement proved futile.
We've suffered a critical failure. It came out of nowhere. I thought we'd hit something, just a huge bang, and then all hell broke loose. System alarms firing off everywhere. All drives are offline, repair attempts are ongoing, but with no success. Evidence points to one of the cooling systems exploding on a routine cycle. It sent pieces flying through the propulsion system, shredding it, chains of explosions, and... well, the long and the short of it is the ship's a dead stick. We're drifting. No engine. No means of altering course. I guess we're lucky the power plant didn't go up, or we wouldn't be alive to make reports.
By 2306, engineering teams estimated that the remaining supplies, food, water, and essential components would be exhausted within a decade. The prospect of drifting helplessly in deep space forced the crew and colonists to make a desperate plan. They decided to dismantle large sections of the ship, repurposing the hull and internal structures into smaller, self-sustaining lifeboats. Over the next several years, massive portions of the vessel were torn apart, reconfigured, and painstakingly rebuilt. Plasteel bulkheads became the shells of new spacecraft. Wiring and engine components were salvaged for propulsion and navigation modules. A skeletal framework of the original ship remained, barely sufficient to support a diminished number of inhabitants. While the colonists worked to complete the lifeboats, time pressed on. Children were born, and the population continued to grow beyond the capacity of the newly constructed vessels. By 2312, the day arrived when the lifeboats were declared spaceworthy. An impossible choice lay before them. Who would board the vessels and who would remain behind? After lengthy discussions, the settlers agreed to give priority to women and children. The remaining seats would be filled by lottery, and then volunteers would be asked to stay with the Lazarus expedition. The decision sparked grief and relief in equal measure. Parents unwilling to leave their children, friends torn between loyalty and hope. Some families were split apart by the realities of limited space, but everyone understood the stakes. If they did nothing, all would perish in the coming years. In 2313, the lifeboats launched. Groups of colonists, each guided by its own navigational charts, set out toward multiple habitable worlds within range. Their transmissions spoke of trepidation mixed with cautious optimism. No one knew how far their fuel would carry them or whether those planets could truly sustain human life. Yet they believed this was their best chance at survival. Those who remained on the Lazarus expedition watched the departing vessels fade into darkness. For them, the old ship was home, and they had accepted their fate. Supplies ran low, and eventually communication with the lifeboats ceased. The final entries in the ship's log spoke of quiet resolve, a sense of purpose fulfilled. They had sacrificed themselves to ensure that some part of humanity might endure, carrying forward the legacy of the Lazarus expedition into unknown stars. The Atlas was launched in 2245, a marvel of engineering that promised to carry its passengers safely across centuries of travel to a distant star system. For generations, the ship's inhabitants lived in relative stability, maintaining complex life support systems and passing down knowledge vital to their eventual arrival. Despite the inevitable hardships of such a journey, each new chief engineer took up the mantle of protecting the vessel's integrity. When Tom Edwards inherited that role in 2799, the Atlas was finally approaching its destination world. It was during a routine systems check that Edwards discovered a fatal oversight. The ship's braking mechanism had never functioned properly.
The captain told the crew the bad news. They've known for months now, but until today it's been on a need-to-know basis. Now it's out there. We can't stop the ship. I remember telling the captain about the fault, a manufacturing issue that no one else had detected. I felt responsible. After all, I'm the ship's engineer. Like my father and his father before him. All he said was, "We'll fix it." Now months on, we're nearing our destination and no closer to finding a solution. But in lieu of a fix, I believe I have an alternative.
A hidden manufacturing fault, dormant since the Atlas's construction, meant it was impossible to slow the vessel for a safe orbital insertion. With the entire population's future at stake, Edwards laid out a plan with the ship's command council. Rather than attempt a doomed landing, the Atlas would adjust its course and pass by the target planet. During that flyby, escape pods would launch, carrying passengers and vital equipment down to the surface. There was one tragic catch. The pod controls required manual input from within the ship. Someone had to remain behind to operate them. Despite his wife Jean being pregnant, Edwards volunteered without hesitation. He insisted that she join the evacuation along with all other vulnerable individuals. An intricate schedule was devised to send pods in timed intervals, each carrying families, technicians, and the means to establish a colony. Every resource they could spare was loaded aboard the vessels in the hope of giving the settlers the best possible chance on their new world. The escape sequence commenced in early 2800. One pod, launched prematurely in a moment of panic, malfunctioned and exploded. Though the loss of those souls was devastating, the rest of the evacuation proceeded successfully. As each pod departed, Edwards remained at his station, ensuring the timing and trajectory were correct. He maintained contact with the ship's captain until the final pod cleared the hangar. In their last transmission, the captain promised to name their colony after Edwards, in honor of his sacrifice. With the Atlas speeding onward, all communications soon fell silent. Now, devoid of passengers, the ship continued under minimal power for an unknown period. Eventually, its fuel reserves were spent, and the Atlas settled into a lonely drift. Centuries later, salvagers discovered its remains, the hull battered by micrometeoroids, but still bearing traces of the modifications designed to launch so many escape pods. Records recovered from the bridge revealed the engineer's meticulous logs and the final haunting moments of the evacuation. Though Tom Edwards never joined his wife or the colony that would bear his name, his legacy endures. The Pleon was launched in 2249, a time when humanity believed that careful planning and robust technology could overcome any obstacle posed by the vastness of space. Designed to carry hundreds of passengers over centuries of travel, the vessel's mission was clear: reach a distant, potentially habitable world and establish a new home. For decades, life aboard the ship proceeded smoothly. Generations were born, and each child was raised with the understanding that they would never see Earth. Instead, they would sustain their world in transit, nurturing it for those who would one day arrive at the final destination. By 2293, however, a quiet crisis began to unfold. Anomalies in birth records showed a steep decline in female infants. At first, it seemed like an odd statistical fluke, but as the ratio of male to female births grew more skewed, the ship's medical officer, Dr. Dryhef Emil Brandt, began investigating. He discovered a disturbing truth. The male passengers were producing only Y chromosome gametes. Under normal circumstances, such a genetic quirk might have been corrected through available medical technology, but Dr. Brandt's predecessor had deemed advanced embryonic manipulation equipment unnecessary, leaving the Pleonese population without any means of intervention.
I've researched some statistics, and there could be a problem. Over the past 3 months, 75% of pregnancies have provided a male fetus. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about right now, although I'm starting to think my predecessor made a mistake, not bringing any medical equipment that could manipulate gender at the embryonic stage. I mean, I can understand the ethics behind it, but this has left us hanging a little bit. Especially now we're in this situation. I can only hope it evens itself out. Situation is now critical. We've had no female newborns for the past 9 months, and all recent pregnancies have produced male fetuses. I'm currently looking into the problem, and it would appear that none of the ship's complement are producing male gametes with the XX chromosome. That means that even if we could artificially inseminate with a sample, we still wouldn't produce any zygotes with the potential to form a female embryo. I have no idea how to solve this, as we have no stock with both XX and XY samples on the ship. Another mistake my predecessor made. If I can find out the cause of this anomaly, hopefully it will lead me to a solution. We have time to fix this, and I'm not panicking yet, but this has the potential to be disastrous to the success of our mission.
Over the next decade, the few remaining women aged out of their childbearing years. By 2307, the ship's inhabitants had reached a stark realization. there would be no more generations. With every potential mother entering menopause and no female infants among the newborns, the mission's future was sealed. Hope of reaching the target world with a viable community had vanished. Driven by desperation, the men decided to dismantle parts of the Pleon in order to construct smaller vessels. The plan was to seek out other settlements or stations that might offer help and genetic resources, preserving whatever remained of their chances to survive. As the new ships neared completion, a final question loomed. Who would stay behind? With the Pleon drifting helplessly toward oblivion, there was only space for a portion of the population to escape. A consensus emerged, and the men departed in these jury-rigged craft. Dr. Brandt, however, chose to remain aboard. He had long dedicated himself to the Pleon and its people, and he could not bear the thought of abandoning the vessel that had carried him and countless others through the darkness. Sealing off the medical bay, Dr. Brandt recorded his last observations. He expressed relief that small part of the Pleon's population still had a chance, however slim, to survive. Then his logs ended. The once thriving ship continued adrift, empty but for a single caretaker who had accepted his fate. It became a silent memorial to the fragility of life and the unpredictable forces that can undo even the most carefully laid plans. The Thetus was launched in 2230, intended to support multiple generations of travelers on a centuries-long journey toward a distant, potentially habitable star. Their sense of routine and stability ran deep, anchored by lessons passed down through each generation. Shortly after the 9th generation came of age, unsettling reports began circulating among the passengers. People claimed to hear faint whispers emanating from comms units, barely audible crackles that seemed like static at first.
Still all quiet out here in the black. Just had our very first 9th gen child born on ship. That takes the current population to 17,401. Other than that, nothing out of the ordinary. Apart from reports from some residents at the northern end of C deck. They've heard some kind of strange whispering sound coming from their apartment comms unit. I'm sure it's nothing, but I've dispatched a member of tech to investigate.
Over the following weeks, these whispers grew more distinct, eventually forming words no one could ignore. Many described a single phrase repeated over and over. Fear spread among the population, and attempts to isolate the cause commenced immediately. Engineers conducted exhaustive diagnostics on the communications array, believing it was merely interference. When that yielded no answers, the captain assigned security teams to monitor comms activity. But the signal defied every effort to block, cut, or scramble it. It penetrated every deck, echoing through quarters and workstations with relentless insistence. Soon, some who heard the whispers began showing signs of extreme paranoia. Tensions rose and outbursts of violence erupted. Entire decks fell silent under waves of brutal attacks perpetrated by those who claimed to be chosen by the voice in the comms. The security teams, ill-prepared for such internal chaos, struggled to contain the growing madness. Crew members found phrases scrawled in an unknown script, written in blood on walls and in corridors. Those who could still think clearly barricaded themselves behind bulkheads, but safety proved temporary at best. An investigation led by the chief communications officer traced the signal to a planet the Thetus had passed about 15 light-years earlier, an uninhabited rock known only for a peculiar electromagnetic field recorded in the ship's logs. No intelligent life was believed to exist there, yet the planet's faint digital broadcast seemed tailored to induce aggression in those who heard it. One surviving crew member who left a partial journal mentioned hearing the whisper through a shorted comm unit. He described the sensation as if something alive were speaking directly into his mind, urging him toward violence. Panicked transmissions from multiple decks told the same story, people snapping without warning, then turning on their friends and families. Despite repeated attempts to quarantine affected individuals and shut down the comms network, the signal's influence proved unstoppable. Most of the Thetis' population was lost within weeks, entire sections of the ship descending into madness and bloodshed. The final recorded transmission is nearly indecipherable. Fragments of static interspersed with the same whisper that had plagued them from the start. There are no subsequent records of survivors or rescue operations. For centuries, the Thetis remained adrift, a silent testament to the danger of an unearthly signal that reached across the stars and turned hope into terror. The Odysseus was launched in 2065, one of several ambitious attempts to ferry humanity to distant star systems long before the advent of quicker-than-light travel. Designed to carry multiple generations, it was stocked with hydroponic farms, recycling facilities, medical stations, and a formidable power core intended to run for centuries. For the first few decades of the voyage, life aboard the Odysseus was calm, punctuated by only the occasional crisis, mechanical or social, that the settlers learned to manage. By 2201, the population had expanded enough to necessitate a formal government. In an election marred by heated debates about the future, a governing council took absolute power, deciding that no one would risk colonizing an unknown planet.
Order! Order! I will have order in the house! It is decided then. The mission is changed. We, the elected council of the Odysseus, decree that all members of the crew remain on board, and all resources for the ill-conceived planetary colonization mission are to be reallocated to enable the Odysseus to sustain us. Order! Order! Any and all attempts to leave the ship, question the council, or otherwise reinstate the previous mission parameters is to be considered a capital offense. For the greater good.
They believed the ship itself was safer than any unpredictable surface could ever be. There was ample food, water, and energy. To most of the passengers, the decision seemed prudent. If they were already thriving in the void, why gamble on an alien world? This shift in mission objectives carried on for generations. During the fifth generation of travelers, around 2287, the Odysseus was beset by a virulent disease. The council, desperate to contain the infection, enacted martial law. Entire decks were quarantined, their residents locked in. When the council deemed the situation dire, they vented those sections into space, sacrificing a portion of the population in the hope of saving the rest. Dissent grew among the survivors. A faction emerged that wanted to depose the council, believing that colonizing a planet might be their best chance at freedom and safety. However, generations spent aboard the Odysseus had eroded any knowledge or practical skill for planetary settlement. Few had the nerve to challenge the council's decisions, and even fewer had a plan for survival outside the steel corridors of the only home they had ever known. Though brutal, the council's methods appeared effective for a time. The disease subsided, and the ship continued drifting on its endless journey. Yet the pathogen was not eradicated. It reemerged around 2310 with renewed ferocity, cutting down entire families in a matter of weeks. The council's draconian measures no longer sufficed. Quarantining new segments of the ship only delayed the inevitable. After 20 years of futile struggle, the council itself succumbed, and most of the population perished alongside them. In the end, only scattered individuals remained. Among them was a passenger who managed to record a final message. The date on the log read 2331, and his voice trembled as he spoke of empty corridors littered with the memories of lost lives. He warned anyone who might one day find the Odysseus to keep their distance, describing the disease's unstoppable spread and the devastation wrought by those who believed life aboard the ship was an eternal guarantee. The Hyperion was launched in 2252, a grand endeavor intended to carry humanity to a distant star system over many generations. For more than a century, life aboard followed the usual rhythms of a long-haul voyage: births, deaths, education, and the careful maintenance of a vessel that served as both home and lifeline. According to the ship's logs, everything changed around the year 2365, when a child named Zachariah captured the imagination of the passengers.
Our voyage continues apace. All systems fully operational. We had some issues with the hydroponics units, but maintenance has managed to solve that problem. The only other thing to report is the religious fervor that seems to be gripping some sections of crew and passengers. Apparently, there's this boy. I think he's around 10 or something, and people are heralding him as the second coming. There's a rumor he can perform miracles, but it's obviously only a story. Commander Jefferson wasn't too impressed when he heard, but I managed to calm him down. Told him it was good for people to have something to believe in, especially on a voyage like this one.
Initially, Zachariah was seen as little more than a charismatic child with an uncanny ability to calm disputes. However, rumors spread that he performed small miracles, flawless predictions of environmental hiccups, knowledge of problems in the reactor core before technicians discovered them, and even insights into personal matters that he had no logical way of knowing. Within months, a fervent group of believers began to worship Zachariah, hailing him as a messiah who would guide them to a so-called promised land. By 2370, Zachariah's following had grown large enough to concern the ship's command structure. The commander attempted to intervene when one of the worship rituals turned chaotic. He ordered Zachariah confined to quarters, hoping to prevent further unrest and reassert official authority. This move sparked outrage among the child's followers, who saw the act as sacrilegious. In a terrifying escalation, the commander was seized and shoved into an airlock, then forcibly ejected into the void. No attempt was made to hide or justify the killing. Those loyal to Zachariah claimed it was the will of their chosen leader. Freed from any meaningful opposition, Zachariah revealed a doctrine that stunned even some of his own followers. He spoke of opening the ship's airlocks all at once, insisting that doing so would elevate them to a higher plane of existence. Some questioned the logic, but the fear of descent and the magnetic grip of Zachariah's personality kept most silent. A handful of passengers covertly plotted to end the child's life, believing it was the only way to save themselves and the entire crew. A young midshipman, who had remained largely outside the cult's influence, took up the plan to kill Zachariah before he could carry out his final ritual. Though his personal logs are only partially intact, they detail his intent to strike when Zachariah was alone. Whether he was discovered and killed, or simply too late, remains unknown. The ship's surveillance records show that the life support override was triggered shortly after the midshipman's last known whereabouts. By 2371, the Hyperion had become a tomb. Its airlocks opened in unison, venting the atmosphere into space. Everyone aboard presumably died within minutes. Centuries later, salvage teams found the vessel adrift, its hulls absent of life but echoing with traces of the passengers' final days. Data recovered from the mainframe revealed only fragments of a doctrine that promised salvation through asphyxiation, and the last entries in the midshipman's logs, which spoke of a desperate mission to prevent the unimaginable. The Venusian was launched in 2237, intended to be a self-sustaining world for its thousands of inhabitants as it made the slow journey to a distant star system. The ship's design featured multiple biodomes to grow food, robust recycling systems for water and air, and carefully managed resource stockpiles to ensure the population's survival across generations. For nearly a century, its voyage proceeded without major incident. Each generation was raised to maintain the delicate balance required to keep the ship operational, carrying the hope of establishing a new home on an uncharted world. According to recovered logs dated to 2321, a small pirate fleet unexpectedly intercepted the Venusian. The attackers boarded under the cover of engine malfunctions and reactor fluctuations, which they had likely induced themselves through sabotage. Their objective was simple yet brutal: seize as many passengers as possible and sell them into slavery.
They came out of a gas nebula, a pirate fleet, all manner of ships, and some of them highly modified. Every single one was red, though. Blood red. Our auto defenses were useless, and raiders breached the hull with mining lasers. By the time they got inside, I'd managed to rustle up a decent defense force, but we couldn't stop them spreading through the decks. The fighting was fierce at first, and we put up a good resistance, but when the best of our crew were cut down, there was nothing the rest of us could do. All I could do was initiate a rearguard action while we tried to save as many people as we could. Deacon managed to rally some troops, and we pushed them back long enough to retreat to aft. Not sure how much longer we're gonna last. Deacon keeps talking about a parlay, but these are pirates on a slave hunt. They won't stop until we're all dead or in chains. Frankly, I'd take death over slavery any day.
Though the Venusian was not designed for combat, a handful of crew members managed to mount a defense. Led by a determined security officer, they rallied about 100 passengers to a fortified section of the ship, sealing bulkheads and disabling key corridors in a desperate effort to hold the pirates at bay. For a time, the blockade held. The logs paint a picture of tense days and sleepless nights, with both sides exchanging threats and sporadic gunfire. The pirates tried to breach the fortifications with portable tools, but the thick hull plating and emergency seals held firm. Morale among the barricaded group remained fragile, yet some clung to the belief that they could negotiate or outlast the intruders until a patrol might stumble upon them. That hope was shattered when the ship's executive officer turned traitor. The logs do not explain his motive, only that he revealed to the pirates the location of hidden maintenance tunnels snaking through the Venusian's lower decks. These tunnels had been designed for repairs and inspections, known only to senior staff. With access to these concealed routes, the pirates bypassed the barricades entirely. A final entry in the logs describes the pirates bursting into the makeshift stronghold from behind, catching the defenders entirely off guard. Gunfire and screams filled the corridors as the desperate standoff ended in minutes. The pirates, outnumbering and surrounding the defenders, swiftly subdued or killed everyone within. What became of the 100 passengers is clearly implied. Those who survived the attack were enslaved. The entire population of the ship, crew and civilians alike, faced either death or a life of servitude. When the pirates departed, they left the Venusian drifting and abandoned. Centuries later, an exploratory vessel stumbled upon the derelict craft. They found corridors strewn with signs of a violent battle, scorch marks, barricaded doors, and the remains of security stations. The Lyan was launched in 2219 with the dream of carrying its passengers across centuries to a star system identified as a potential new home. For nearly 100 years, life aboard the ship was uneventful by design. Generations of inhabitants lived out their days maintaining hydroponic gardens, sustaining environmental systems, and preserving the knowledge needed to ensure their descendants would eventually step onto an alien world. In 2328, according to recovered logs, a team of surveyors was dispatched to investigate a dense asteroid field. The mission was routine: scan for mineral resources, test the ice composition in smaller fragments, and retrieve samples for study. When they returned, no one suspected that a lethal stowaway had arrived with them. The logs detail how a strange microorganism began circulating among the crew within days of the survey team's return.
Precision's log 2379/2. Nothing out of the ordinary to report. Minor injuries, aches, and pains from the more vulnerable crew members, and the usual bout of influenza you'd expect with so many people living in such close confines. It seems the current strain of influenza is becoming resistant to the vaccines we've developed on board. Only thing of note was a minor injury to one of the survey team. Gottlieb sustained a minor laceration. He was taking a mineral sample on a nearby asteroid. The suit got braids, but he managed to apply an emergency seal before anything serious happened. I only hope the sample he took was worth the scar it's gonna leave.
At first, it presented with common influenza-like symptoms: headaches, fever, coughing fits. Medical officers treated the afflicted with the standard antiviral regimens, but nothing worked. Many improved temporarily, only to relapse with worsening complications. Despite attempts to quarantine the sick, the infection spread at an alarming rate, touching every deck of the Lyan. Efforts to create a vaccine were hampered by the microorganism's apparent immunity to conventional treatments. Researchers in the ship's medical bay documented repeated failures. Every antiviral drug, every inoculation protocol, and every makeshift therapy had no effect. The virus-like agent adapted to new countermeasures faster than they could be deployed. By 2330, entire families were succumbing to the disease. Maintenance logs recorded a frantic scramble to keep crucial systems online with a dwindling workforce. Crews abandoned routine ship operations to aid the sick, leaving critical tasks unfinished. Hydroponic yields began to drop, and environmental regulation systems ran dangerously close to failure. The desperation in the logs is palpable. Daily updates reflect exhaustion, confusion, and fear that they were fighting an enemy they could neither see nor contain. The final entries suggest that by late 2331, only a handful of souls were left. Even the chief medical officer, who had dedicated every hour to finding a cure, eventually fell ill. As life support staff began dying, the reactors lost consistent oversight, and parts of the ship powered down one by one. In the end, the Lyan slipped into silence, drifting through space with no one at the helm. It was discovered centuries later, adrift in its present location. Boarding teams found no survivors and minimal residual power. The logs, though heavily fragmented, told the story of a once thriving community devastated by an alien pathogen, a microscopic hitchhiker that turned the Lyan into a grave. No signs of the microorganism remained, leaving only the chilling record of how it overwhelmed every effort to stop it, dooming an entire generation to a silent end among the stars.